National University Teleconference Network, in cooperation with Oklahoma State University, presents Student Affairs, a historical perspective and a view of the future.
Welcome to today's teleconference. I'm Gwen Faulkner, your moderator for this afternoon, and we'd like to welcome you to Oklahoma State University, where we're broadcasting live. It's our intention today to talk about student affairs, and we have some very distinguished people here with us in studio who are going to present their ideas, but we also have some highlights from the Chicago conference, as many people refer to it. Actually, it was the ACPA NASPA conference celebrating the 37th statement. We'll get into that more later. Right now, though, I would like for you to meet our distinguished panel. First, sitting next to me here is Dr. Lorene Fitzgerald. She is a professor of educational policy and leadership at The Ohio State University. Next to her is Dr. Arthur Sandeen, Vice President of Student Affairs and a professor of educational leadership at the University of Florida. Next to him, Dr. Ann Pruitt, Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence and a professor of educational policy and leadership at Ohio State University. And finally, Dr. James C. Hurst, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and a professor of psychology at the University of Wyoming. It's our intention today to show you some of the highlights of the conference and also to show you some videotape segments to give you food for thought, if you will. Then we will have a panel discussion and invite your telephone calls as well. So let's get on with our conference. First of all, we'd like to present to you some videotape segments. The co-coordinator of the Celebration Conference is Dr. Tom Thielen. It was his idea to present this kind of a video conference to you, to give you an opportunity to find out about the conference, but to react to what was said there and the issues of the future. So let's take a look first at this video segment of Dr. Tom Thielen.
Good morning. The decision by the Board of Directors of NASPA and ACPA in the early 1980s to meet jointly in the city of Chicago in 1987 set the wheels in motion for an historic professional event in the area of student affairs work in higher education. When the Convention Planning Committee at its first meeting nearly 2 years ago decided that this meeting would be a joint conference rather than two associations meeting at the same time in the same hotel but doing virtually separate conferences, the die was cast for what the planners felt was an extraordinary opportunity to celebrate the common bonds shared by the members of both associations. The timing, 1987, gave us the good fortune of utilizing the American Council on Education's document, approved 50 years ago in April of 1937, known as the Student Personnel Point of View, as the basic foundation to celebrate our past. The location, Chicago, one of the most famous cities in the world, renowned for its architectural plan and design. The stirring words, "Make no little plans," authored by Daniel Burnham, co-director of the Chicago plan. The interaction of all these variables dictated that we do more than just the usual at a national meeting. The planners felt that this event should not begin and end in Chicago, but have a continuance. We designed a conference that commemorated our past, celebrated our present, with a vision to the future. We believe our dreams were realized. The 5,500 participants who came to Chicago last month had an abundance of good spirit and a tremendous amount of interest in the central theme of the conference. Following the Burnham words, "A noble, logical design once recorded will never die," thus, this teleconference was developed for you to participate in today. We hope it'll permit you to relate to national leaders in our field and allow more extensive development of current critical issues to be discussed on a nationwide basis. We express appreciation of the National University Teleconferencing Network and to Sandra Bird from the Office of Vice President for Student Services at Oklahoma State University, who coordinated the work of this teleconference. We are happy to have you join us today, and we wish you an exciting, stimulating time during the next several hours.
And we are broadcasting to over 130 sites across the nation. We welcome you, and we want you to look at these videotape segments with great interest, because the first one I think you'll find very interesting. Dr. Mel Hardy. She is well known for her extraordinary writing and her unique lectures. She goes back to the 37th statement and perhaps put it into perspective for all of us. Dr. Mel Hardy.
To some, the 1937 SPPOV was itself a myth. Too fragile, too little of substance to really merit any long-time examination. Reduced to its numerical definitions or count, it is just this. There was a merged idea of two men who in turn conferred with the president of a higher education confederation, who in turn singled out 16 persons for a 2-day table talk, which in turn produced a 14-page document in 4 parts, and which, paper-bound document as it was, sold for the nominal sum of 10 cents. The 1937 personnel point of view contains approximately 4,000 words. The foreword is a single page. The philosophy contains 2 pages, one of 6 paragraphs, and one of 23 services. By far the largest amount of space is given, 5 pages in all, to coordination, which is a theory of administration heretofore not given very much attention by our literature. The final 2.5 pages deals with future development of personnel services. It's the 23 services which have been singled out as the heart of our document. And the heartbeat occurs in such words as these verbal adjectives: assisting, determining, enlisting, supporting, administering, evaluating. The coordination section, omitted in most of the testimonials of the document's worth, supplies 6 mandates guaranteed to keep intact the design, the central design, and the operating relationship of an idea. That idea was the student personnel point of view. So let's begin with a date of April 16 into a 2-day conference which was called for Washington, D.C. For this event, there was what was called a scenario, but better called by their authors a prospectus. It had been written, completed in June of 1936, a year before the conference. There was a production crew of 3 technicians on and off stage, and there were the 16 featured actors whose discourse, at least a part of it, has been filed in the archives of the American Consul. The prospectus was written by 2 educators from the state of Ohio, W.J. Cowley, professor at Ohio State, and D.H. Gardner, dean of students at the University of Akron. Their conceptual idea was a great one. It was to bring together 2 seemingly different kinds of higher educators: the teacher, yes, the trainer, yes, the major professor, but that's all one. And on the other side, the prototype, the practitioner, the administrator, and the manager of campus life. So together they came. This was a larger-than-life kind of concept for that time and even for ours. The precedent had been earlier set by 2 men. Dr. L.B. Hopkins of Northwestern University had cleared an opening in the thicket of student personnel work by looking at 14 institutions who purported to have student personnel services. And 9 years later, in 1935, by Gardner, who had studied those institutions with student personnel services affiliated with the North Central. Both surveys showed the same: a distancing, misunderstanding, merging upon antagonism between academicians and student personnel workers. So Cowley and Gardner joined company to effect a plan to minimize the misunderstandings. Their immediate goal was to make clear, to define the types and the functions and the organization of these services. But from the beginning, their partnership had need of a philanthropic windfall. And in Broadway, this is called, you know, an angel. Their quest led them to Washington, D.C., and to the American consul, and their hope was, at the distance, even though the distance, to make the connection. At this point, I would stop to say that, in my belief, we have spent all too little time in our organizations in studying the political ingenuity of some of our forebears, and this extends to some of our present bearers of standard. And I do believe that Cowley and Gardner had a system of political ingenuity that will beckon you to study what it is they did, at what times they did it, and what amounts, all of this, to make clear the plight of the organization. Back to my script, because that was a side remark. You know, a kind of preachment. Dr. George Zook was the man to whom they looked, president of the American Council. And this was the connection, political connection, of course, but it was worked on in the right way. He had been president of the University of Akron at the time that Gardner had been dean of students. And the message relayed to this man, stated in 10 words, was simply, "Sir, a study of student personnel work is urgently needed." And I can almost hear that urgency in their dual voices. Theirs was an action program. It would begin with the convening of 16 persons for study. It would seek to define in all its particularities what it was student personnel work was, and it would direct efforts to inform, but later to disarm, those academicians. Now, this is no small plan of that time or our time. It is a plan of great proportion. In his dissertation, and Bill was to have come, Dr. W.W. Blazer was to have come, but a flu bug did him in, and so I have his statement. We wish we might have had him in our company. Bill researched the contributions of the American Council on Education to student personnel work. In his dissertation, he said, the student personnel point of view, get on your glasses, all of you who have them in your purses. The SPP is the most widely quoted and used statement in the field of college personnel work, which, along with its 1949 revision, continues to be quoted or paraphrased in most articles purporting to cover the field. End of his quote. Now, with this kind of support, I would say you can assert, as I do without contradiction, that the philosophy underlying the statement, 1 page in length, is a statement of the reaffirmation of the student as a whole person. How whole? 8 dimensions. The intellectual, the emotional, the physical, the social, the vocational, the moral, the economic, and the aesthetic. The 8. My classes must memorize these. We are reminded that this view has had a long and honorable history in this country, that the whole person belief is as old as education in America, and this is confirmed by Eugenie Andres Leonard, University of Minnesota, in her book called Origins of Student Personnel Work. From the 1630s to the 1930s, 3 centuries, the whole person philosophy dominated, except for the 3 decades in the 19th century, 1870, 1880, 1890, immediately after the war between the states, when certain needs, forces, really social forces, directed interests away from the needs of students to the extension of the boundaries of knowledge, and particularly science and scientific research. As subject matter was expanded, the student, as a subject of study, was suspended. He, she was put on hold. But the philosophy in its reaffirmation is the core of our document. Ours is a similar commitment contained in the U.S. Constitution in these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident. And the truths we know concern the learner, youth, adults in American higher education. I believe the 1937 Charter has points of view comparable in other ways to the Constitution of the United States in this, its 200th anniversary. For example, the prefatory paragraph of the Constitution of the United States proposes forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, and promoting the general welfare. How like to our prefatory paragraph. Ours proposes promoting the general welfare of a selected group, namely students, thereby transmitting and preserving the products of scholarship, of creative imagination, and of human experience. How shall this be done in our charter? There are two short, terse objectives. I will read the first, and the second will appear upon the screens. The first, we will do this by assisting the student in developing to the limits of his or her potentialities. You'll hear the word again and later. The second goal, assisting the students in making a contribution to the betterment of society. The first, which I read, has received the major attention. The second trails. And what is the reason? There are several. It is possible that the betterment of society, this good and improved America, was and still is an impossible dream, that is to say, a myth. Yet I believe that the perceptions of the 16 persons chartering our document, for them, there was no meager understanding of the good society of that time. And as we move on and toward the end of this review, historian Theodore White has written that the Constitution of the United States was an idea which became a nation. I would contend that our Charter of 1937 is an idea which became a profession. It assuredly gave stature to that profession, and you can add to that. Our document is a product of an age half a century ago, and we are judging whether or not the issues of the past can be revived to support the document in its then time and to predict its durability in our time.
Dr. Mel Hardy, certainly a person who can explain our historic perspective on the student personnel point of view, but we have others that can talk about that. At the Chicago conference, we were able to interview the two living participants of the 37th paper, and so I'd like for you to meet one of them. The first is C. Gilbert Wren. In this statement, he explains to you the philosophy of the 37th statement, and he also explains to you what qualities a person must have to go into our profession. Dr. C. Gilbert Wren.
I think the student development concept was a good one. It was intended to say, to give attention to what happened in the 37 document was that the student was portrayed as a unified person, what we call a holistic concept, a whole.
Yes.
And there are various dimensions of the person, interrelated, interacting, and no part of which is performing without the influence of the rest of the parts. In colleges, we've had a much of attention to the cognitive, the intellectual, so-called, the left brain activity. Mm-hmm. And that's been the end of some college endeavors. What I'd like to see now would be to see us pick up what was introduced 50 years ago and say, really, the student operates as a whole. His spiritual, emotional, environmental pressure, family, the totality of him is a whole, and colleges must see that. And if they stress only the cognitive, only the structured, only the vocational, they're missing the fact that that is not the whole person. If I were to select the qualities of those who deal with people in people relationships, I would say that they're not really at top level in their performance unless they are concerned, that they're able to show that their concern for others is their primary concern. Their concern for others is more than their concern for themselves.
The second living participant that we were able to talk to was Dr. Esther Lloyd Jones. Now, Dr. Jones was concerned about the people who enter our profession from varying disciplines and the pros and cons of each of the disciplines, who makes the best student affairs professional. Dr. Esther Lloyd Jones.
Oh, I think student personnel work has come a long way. It's recognized. I mean, people know, higher education people all, I think, know what it is nowadays. They didn't know then. It was just bits and pieces. And now it has come together. It is organized to a very large extent. A great many of the people in the field of student personnel work were brought up in psychology. Hal was a psychologist, I was a psychologist. That had been our majors for our doctor's degrees. And it was sort of thought of as a psychologically based activity and based in psychology. And I see now, student personnel point of view, should derive its scientific basis much, much more from cultural anthropology and social psychology and sociology. There's much more, there's more gold in them hills than I think. I think we've pretty well drained psychology. We should still train our students in psychology, but I'm just waiting for the first people to do some research using anthropological methods applied, adapted to groups. And there are groups all over the campus. And the groups are tremendously important to the development of individuals.
But it was at the Chicago conference that Dr. Gary Knock of Miami University of Ohio addressed the kind of people that go into student affairs. Dr. Gary Knock.
31 years ago, Cowley commented that three kinds of people engage in student personnel work professionally: the humanitarians, the administrators, and the scientists. The humanitarians came first, and they tended to be sentimentalist in the sense that, quoting Cowley, they often advocate building utopias without knowing much about architecture and construction engineering. Cowley commented further that student personnel services, like all enterprises, needs humanitarians, but not too many of them. The first wave of student personnel administrators came largely from the ranks of the humanitarians. The second wave of administrators, who entered the field between roughly 1930 and 1960, were appointed, Cowley would say, primarily because of their administrative ability rather than because of their compelling interest in students. The psychologists, the scientists in Cowley's depiction, arrived upon the scene just after World War I and brought a rigor and a commitment to research and counseling that contributed very significantly to giving increased status to student personnel work among administrators, faculty, students, and indeed the general public. It is worth mentioning that these three kinds of professionals really had very little in common. Cowley, in fact, observed in 1956 that the so-called student personnel movement of the post-war period was not a movement at all. Instead, it was really a collection of independent wheels turning at different rates and often in different directions.
But perhaps we need to turn to the president of NASPA to put it all into perspective. How very similar the work in 1937 is to today. Dr. Judith Chambers, president of NASPA, shares this with you.
Pause on this important occasion to recognize that ours is a proud and a grand profession filled with important transcendent values. We pause to recognize that ours is an emerging profession that consists of so much more than people who simply manage. We are, after all, a profession that has a heart and a soul. We are fundamentally educators who happen to preside over a diverse and important array of services and programs that represent only a means to an end, never an end in themselves. The residence halls, the intramural fields, the counseling centers, the campus walkways are all special kinds of classrooms that allow us to do what we do best. The students who come to us today need many of the same things that the students needed in 1937 when they went to see the dean. Then, as now, students need what William Faulkner has called the old truths and verities of the heart: love and honor, pity and pride, compassion and sacrifice, the only things worth writing about and the only things worth working for. Today on our individual campuses, we are key members of a leadership team constantly re-examining institutional purposes. As student affairs professionals, we bring to that experience an enormously strong institutional commitment, along with diverse sets of values, but sharing commonality of goals. We are the ones who must remind others that the human spirit within our students has not changed. From us, the students must hear the stories we heard from Gilbert Wren, from Kate Mueller, from E.G. Williamson, Esther Lloyd Jones, Fred Turner, and Mel Hardee. The story is the same. The story they need to hear is about the campus, a place to learn, to grow, and to experience. A place to reflect about the future, about fears and dreams and despair, about love and honor, pity and pride, compassion and sacrifice. The most important part of our work has not changed since 1937. We listen, encourage, suggest, guide, intervene, and hope with students, for students, every single day. We come together this evening to celebrate a profession that has never been stronger. We can take enormous pride in who we are, and now as we prepare for the 21st century, the message we must tell others is loud and clear. Any commitment to excellence in higher education must also be a commitment to excellence in student affairs as well. Our mission is to connect people who need with people who care. They care about the human spirit. They tell about the others who have told the story before them, the story about the old truths and verities of the heart. That's what the deans did in 1937. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what deans still do today.
Dr. Judith Chambers, president of NASPA. We now go live in studio here, though, for an important discussion on what has happened to, in quotes, the 37 statement since it was first written in 1937. Here with me in studio, Dr. Art Sandin wants to discuss that because there are some important revisions and exercises, if you will, that are taking place with the 37 statement. I understand the project is called Toward the 21st Century. Can you tell us about it, Dr. Sandin?
Yes, thank you. I'd be happy to. First of all, as Dr. Hardee said in the segment on the tape that we just watched, the 1937 student personnel point of view was really a point of view about education, a very important one for our time, for that time, a point of view that has served our profession extremely well. In the intervening years, of course, World War II took place, and that changed not only the world, but all of higher education and our field as well. So in June of 1948, another group of people in student affairs was convened in Washington, and that group was chaired by E.G. Williamson of the University of Minnesota. And the 1949 statement, or student personnel point of view at that time, was published. I would like to mention three goals that were included in that 1949 statement because I think they're important in terms of what was reflected as a result of the war. First of all, they said that the purposes of higher education should now include education for international understanding, education to serve social problems, and education for a democratic society. That reflected the kinds of changes that World War II had introduced and also, of course, reflected some of the recommendations of the Truman Commission on higher education, that was published in 1947. In commemoration of the 1937 statement, then, Judy Chambers, the president of NASPA, and Bob Atwell, the president of the American Council on Education, which of course was the group that sponsored the first two statements, invited a group of 7 people to write their perspective on student affairs in 1987. I'm very proud to be a member of that drafting group. I'm very pleased to say as well that there's been a great deal of interest expressed in this process throughout the past year. Our group has held 4 formal meetings. We held an open session during the Chicago conference. We have received a large number of letters, including suggestions from our colleagues from throughout the country. We are still involved in this project. It is our charge from these 2 associations to write our perspective on student affairs for 1987. The report is due to these 2 boards on July 1, 1987, and it is our hope that at that time that we will have our point of view about student affairs in 1987 expressed.
Is the trend, though, that students will be students and that the profession remains constant while it changes kind of within the boundaries?
That's one of the things that we've been talking about and debating and hearing from our colleagues about. There are lots of changes, of course, that have taken place in the 50 years since the 1937 statement, and I think that's one of the things that we're here to talk about today.
Let's have some of your colleagues here respond.
I find it interesting that during the series of excerpts that we've just heard, that there seemed to be an emphasis on the humanitarian and the administrative components. I'm referring back to Gary Knox's observation that Cali, clear back in '37, noted that there had been 3 groups that had basically contributed: the humanitarians, the administrators, and the scientists. And then as I listened to Wren, and as I listened to Jones and to Chambers, I felt a tug within me at my humanitarian self, and along with a bit of a tug with regard to my administrative self. It seems to me that there has been an enormous change, particularly since 1967. If I could divide the 37 to 87 into the first 30 years, I think some things happened in '67 that brought into focus the importance of the scientist. And as I listened to Judy Chambers talk about our profession having a heart and a soul, I wanted to stand up and say, yes, and we also have an intellect and rigor. And I think as we go on, we will talk a little bit more about perhaps the scientist, the intellect, the rigor became more necessary as we confronted the challenges of the late '60s.
I'd like to piggyback on that for just a minute, Jim. It seems to me that the '67 to '87 is chronicled, but has been lost in the explosion of knowledge. We do have national archives, known as the College Student Personnel Collection, at Bowling Green State University in the Jerome Library. We've got about 180 feet of history from 1923 through the present time, and the collection began with NASPA, ACPA, and NAWDAC, but now includes the 6 other groups, such as ACUHO, some state groups, financial aids groups, and I really think that we need to urge our listeners to be aware that there's this other resource. The humanitarians, initially coming from psychology, I think were also our researchers. Many of their publications are lost just because of a point in time.
I think you make a good point implicitly, and that is that as we talk of those 3 groups, they weren't always different people. I would like to believe that we had some kind of combination of humanitarians and administrators and scientists within the same person. And I would furthermore like to believe that we are training people to have those 3 components, those skills, those orientations within them today.
There's a point that Esther Lloyd Jones made about the 1937 statement that I'd like to emphasize. She used the phrase political ingenuity that brought the groups together. She talked about the separation between the curriculum and the co-curriculum, or the academic and the student affairs people. And I believe that that is still very much needed. We must recognize the fact that the university is in the knowledge business, and by and large that's going to be the predominant emphasis. But we have to sit down with people in academic affairs and make sure that the student personnel point of view is still recognized. We have some eternal verities, I'd like to call them that, such as wholeness, uniqueness of the individual, helping individuals to grow to the limit of their potential, and so on. And these are just as important now as they were in 1937.
Do student personnel people get in the business of values clarification still with students?
Clearly, I think it's one of the important areas that we have to make contributions to. Let me also expand, as much as Ann mentioned Esther Lloyd Jones. I cannot sit in my chair for long without rising to the occasion to respond to her comment about having drained psychology. First of all, I pay homage to Esther Lloyd Jones for enormous contributions that she has made, and I personally am a benefactor of those. I simply part company with her, and with her statement that psychology has been drained. As long as the person is at the center of what we do, as you're saying, Ann, as long as that's the case, psychology is going to continue to be a partner with us, and a primary partner. The part of what she says that I do like and I celebrate is her emphasis on let's not be limited to that. Surely cultural anthropology, social psychology, sociology have as well enormous contributions to make to us if we will just listen and look and read and educate ourselves. For it's not just the person that is the focus, it's the whole ecology of the person and the educational environment. And I think anthropology, those other areas she mentions, have so much to say about that. But we have not begun to drain psychology of all that it can contribute.
I would also like to add law and management to that list as significant contributors to the work that we do and the skills that we need in our work in student affairs now.
We have to remember that in 1939, Esther Lloyd Jones wrote that landmark book, Student Personnel is Deeper Teaching. And if we could just contemporize a bit of the language within that book, it has a number of verities that we're reinforcing.
It also occurs to me that Esther Lloyd Jones has not been intimately involved with our profession for 20 years. And there have been some things happen in those 20 years that have been phenomenal. And so I think that's right, Betty, and I think much of what she, her frame of reference is more of that era as opposed to this era.
I'd like to add to that by placing what Esther said in context. We have to remember that so much of the emphasis in our field came as a result of the testing that occurred around entry of soldiers into the First World War. And we learned a lot about testing, intelligence testing, and so on. And then a lot of people came into student personnel work from psychology. And as the pendulum swings, I think she remembers that it swung so far over into psychology that it took a lot of effort to bring it back. And I believe that student personnel educators have brought it back. So it is more interdisciplinary than it was at the time when she was talking about it.
One of the messages that I would very much hope would come across, especially to the younger people in our field in watching this history section, is that there's a great deal of compassion that these folks had back in 1937 and still exists in our in our profession today. It's something that I'm very proud of, to be a part of a profession that believes so strongly in people and in helping them and in a point of view about education. These documents may seem dead to some folks, but if they are carefully read, they reflect a great passion for other people, and I think that's an important part of our field and our history.
And I think the strength of Mel Hardee's presentation, really, when she put things into perspective, and as we put our profession and the practice of it today in perspective, the societal values, the trends, the issues, the international impingements, all are a major factor. The administrators may be beleaguered today by financial concerns, but we haven't lost sight of the person.
You know, as I read and reread that statement, I have to watch myself that I don't sit in awe of the wisdom of those people. Sometimes I think as I read that, is there nothing new under the sun, you know, in all that we're doing, because they had such wisdom. And I also will say, as I listen to Gilbert Wren and Esther Lloyd Jones speak, I feel a sense of pride in the identity I feel with them. Like they are our pioneers, you know. They provided us with a legacy. I'm proud to be identified with them. And with Wren's, for example, maturity that he talks about. He epitomizes the very maturity that he talks about.
Let me take this opportunity to share with you a question that has been called in from Southern Methodist University from John Eddy. Thank you for your phone call. And the question is, how well are the holistic concepts addressed by Gilbert Wren being achieved, particularly in the moral and spiritual area, an area that seems to be neglected today?
John, that's a well thought out question. Particularly, I think the component of his question that deals with the religious, with the separation of church and state, and with perhaps those individuals who are enamored with scientific approaches, there is a reluctance on our part to recognize and acknowledge, I would say, religious and spiritual development. There are those among us who are not sure what that is. And, you know, that's a whole different area. But
you don't know what it is?
What spiritual development is. I think it's a realm of, I think, a deliberation and debate, and rightfully so. But in that area, I think that perhaps we have been, as a profession, generally neglectful.
You mentioned the training aspect. Does it tie into the training aspect as well as dealing with the spiritual values?
It certainly could. I would like to say in response to John's question that our literature now is richer in this area than it ever has been before, thanks to people like Kohlberg, Perry, and Gilligan. People in our field are doing some very outstanding things with young students and other students in values development on the campus. But I would also like to say that the old cliche about values, that values are caught, not taught, has lots of implications for what we do as institutions in terms of our policies, in terms of the things that we teach and the things that students learn.
I do think, though, in professional preparation programs, we're beginning to include ethics,
yes,
philosophy, and that's very much supportive, or is directly supportive of what we're talking about in John's question. There seemed to have been a period perhaps between 65 and 85 when we were somewhat leery of dealing with ethics head-on. Now we see that that head-on collision is absolutely mandatory, and other trends and issues have caused us to redirect our attention rather quickly.
I also agree. If I were to identify those needs that are out and about today, attention to moral, ethical issues are there. They're needed. And I do think, Art, in terms of those individuals who provided us with a conceptual leadership, we're ready to do some things
yes,
there
I would agree.
if we just will. My comments were more about the spiritual development as being a little bit different from the moral ethical.
It also supports your earlier statement that our literature is much richer. and we have reconceptualized what it is we hope to do.
Exactly.
When you say if we just will, what will it take for someone or the organization or whatever to take the leadership to deal with it?
You know, I think there are already beginnings. You've implied that, and I agree with that. I think that on some of our campuses, there are those among us who are taking leadership for dealing with that, both on a personal basis in terms of training students and at an institutional basis. For example, to deal with programs related to academic honesty and to see that not just as a matter of punitiveness when violations occur, but rather as a developmental process that must go on.
I sense that our conversation is getting into our next area, so if you all will allow me, we'll continue forward. But before I do continue on, I would be remiss if I did not mention these two things. These segments have given us a good historic perspective of student affairs and the document. Also, I would like to remind you that we do take phone calls. We will be putting the numbers on the screen, but I know that you have received the number ahead of time. You might be thinking of the questions you would like to compose and call them in as well. We will take some calls live, but the others we will have cards, so try to keep them as succinct as possible. Also, for a more in-depth study of our profession, perhaps you'll want to refer to Dr. Robert Schaefer's outline, which was provided for each of you at each site. But now let's continue on. The professional issues. What are the professional issues? Well, we've had a very sound, historic beginning, but some of us are still dealing with the question of, are we a profession? To address that issue, Dr. Paul Blolen would like to talk with you.
Are we a profession? I asked that question in a class this fall of a group of my students in the beginning student affairs class. And I answered it myself, and I said, no, we're not. Silence, utter silence. A look of dismay crept over them. They turned to white. The blood sort of drained from the faces. It took me the rest of the semester to overcome that bad beginning. And I had to explain what I meant by that. And so as I go through it this morning, I hope that you'll bear with me and say that I really do believe. But I have a few things to say about it before I do. Ever since 1949, and probably well before, when Gil Wren and Jack Darley published their chapters in Williamson's Trends in Student Personnel Work, and measuring the student personnel field against their 8 criteria of professional status, leaders in the field have been agonizing over the question and finding student personnel work wanting. Penny called the field a profession stillborn and nearly drove a final nail into the coffin in 1969. And someone by the name of Stamatakis got our collective juices flowing again in his 1981 article. Why do we keep asking ourselves this question? Is it self-flagellation? Hate? What? Let's be forthright about the probable reasons. First and foremost, we recognize and resent the professional marginality of the field. The concept professional marginality stems from sociology and refers to occupations that have sought to distance themselves from their origins as just plain jobs, but have not yet been able to achieve acceptance as a true, quote, profession. They are located on the margin between job and profession because of incomplete professionalization. Second, we want professional status because we want the increased social ranking that goes with professional status, as well as the upward social mobility, which Larson suggests can be transformed into more status and more money. We are attempting to accomplish this task by deliberately manipulating the icons of professionalism. For example, a new code of ethics, the uncritical embracing of student development theory, the standards of training and performance as represented by the CAS standards and guidelines, and so forth. By attempting to create a body of specialized knowledge, in our case student development, by controlling admission to the field through advanced training in that body of knowledge, and by restricting employment in the field to those who follow these prescribed steps, we are implicitly attempting to create a monopoly on our expertise, a monopoly that we hope will lead to social and economic rewards. Now, there's nothing unworthy about these motives. They've been characteristic of members of occupational groups such as law, medicine, and the like that have long exemplified professionalism. But understanding what may be driving our quest may help us better to evaluate its feasibility and desirability. We are by now familiar with the ways in which we have been attempting to determine our relative position and measure our progress toward meeting a common set of criteria. This approach is consistent with that of Cullen, who has listed the dimensions of professionalism. Cullen views the process of professionalism as the extent of the movement from totally lacking certain characteristics to highly developed on each of 7, I believe, relevant dimensions. Those that are more highly developed on certain dimensions are considered to be the more professionalized. Professionalized occupations, according to Cullen, are those which are organized, complex, require long training, possess a code of ethics, are person-oriented, require a license for practice, are devoted to altruistic service, and the like. One can then measure the professionalization of an occupation by determining its position on each of the different criteria. Theorists and researchers have all developed different lists of criteria, but they generally agree upon the same relevant dimensions, and they are very much like those which Wren and Darley began with in 1949. As I say, this is the approach taken by them and by Lew in his 1981 reassessment of this appraisal. As you well know, student affairs was found lacking in both crosscuts. Although Stamotakis gave it to his credit, conceded that some progress had been made in the remaining 32 years. But I have to ask, how can we assess student affairs against these or any other criteria when the so-called profession we are attempting to measure is itself a heterogeneous collection of jobs defined by setting, such as residence halls, function, such as counseling, title, such as coordinator, or clientele, such as international student advisor, or any combination of these? How can we assess student affairs against the Wren and Darley, the Cullen, or any other set of criteria of professionalism when the field is composed of such disparate work activities as academic advisement, psychotherapy, career development, medicine, student activities advising, paraprofessional counseling, management activities, residence hall advising, orientation, and the like? One can take any one of these distinct activities and assess its progress along Cullen's dimensions of professionalism or the Wren and Darley criteria. For example, you can do this with counseling and psychotherapy. But how can you then lump in orientation programming and measure the professionalization of the two combined as if they were a single field? If that causes you problems, now blend in the rest of the student affairs specialties under a single tent, and then try to apply the criteria of profession to the tent rather than to the specialties that it shelters. I don't think it can be done. And furthermore, I don't think it should be done. I think we're wasting our time attempting to shoehorn all of these worthwhile but quite different job specialties into the same shoe, failing and then bemoaning the undeniable fact that our shoes hurt. I can accept the heterogeneity of the field because it appears to me that this diversity is how we are able to meet the needs of the students we serve. However, even the inclusion of social scientific knowledge will not a profession make out of student affairs, it can provide a meaningful foundation for the question I think we should be asking. To what extent do we as practitioners of the various student affairs specialties exhibit the characteristics of professional behavior? Looking at professionalism from the viewpoint of the practitioner's role and responsibility enables us to acculturate, educate, and evaluate the student affairs staff members on the basis of their work performance that can and ought to approximate the highest standards of professionalism regardless of the particular specialty.
Dr. Paul Bloland. And while we're discussing our professionalism, certainly this comes to mind. Have you seen this? It is the CAS Standards and Guidelines for Student Services. It's been endorsed by 22 professional organizations. It's published in 1986. But what have you done with it? Have you used this document on your campus? Dr. William Bryan explains how he used it at his campus at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington.
Hoping it makes some sense to you, what I will do very quickly is just talk through the process that we went through in receiving the standards last spring. In receipt on the campus, the chancellor immediately mailed both copies down the hall to me, which is probably your experience as well. I immediately walked a copy back to him and asked him to please read the standards, and I immediately set an appointment on his calendar to talk about the standards and how we might use those in the Division of Student Affairs. He was very accepting of my suggestions, and the suggestions were that we use those standards this year and review all functional areas within our division. We announced and made real efforts to communicate what we were doing in the year. In discussions with faculty, I went to Faculty Senate. I had time on the agenda to talk about the standards, what we would be doing in review, that we would be inviting faculty to help us. I went to Student Senate to talk in terms of standards, that we would be asking student representation in that review. We covered the information in a newsletter, and to try to at least get some visibility. It was interesting with the feedback following maybe your comment, questions. We did not realize you had standards from faculty. At least 2 faculty approached me on that, and other members in the division made some comments too. We were not aware you had standards that you were following in student affairs. In reviewing, in October, I met with the departments, and prior to that, but we set the guidelines of what we would be doing during the year. We asked that they do a number of things. As I've suggested, the review team, before that, they do an internal review and state what is currently existing in those departments. Then the review team come together and review CAS standards in light of what we're doing and make recommendations, dealing with the should statements, those things that we must be doing based on standards, and looking at the guidelines and differentiating the recommendations in that way in a final report. Okay, I've gone through the process with the report coming to me on August. I will review that report, put it into a composite report to go to the chancellor for discussion. I'm using it as a document for budget purposes, as you suggested, Bob, my end to try to get some advancement, some enhancement in particular areas. I plan to cover it also in the Board of Trustees meeting in the fall. I also plan to present it to the Faculty Senate as a follow-up, a summary of our work during the year. I'm looking at this effort and what departments do as a piece of work that will be placed in our policies, procedures, guidelines, manual for the Division of Student Affairs. I'm looking at it as something that will be updated, reviewed annually based on the recommendations that were there and our movement to try to accomplish meeting those standards or to go beyond or enhance in particular areas. Some values that I think have already been alluded to, but I'll suggest maybe some additional ones here. It's certainly a self-study instrument in looking at where we are, what we're doing, how effective we are in that program. And yes, we are looking 2 years down the road to accreditation, a review. And I think it'll be helpful to us in being in a better situation at that point. I think it's an educational tool for us to educate faculty a little bit more, to educate students, to educate people beyond the division to the things that we do, and to give them copies, and we are providing copies for them to review of the standards for their review. I think it also is helpful as an educational tool as we look at some way of advertising or discussing this in the campus setting. Now, I'm not suggesting that we've done everything that we can do, but we identified some ways to try to enlighten some people in the campus a little bit more. In student affairs, I think it's also a renewal for us in those departments in some areas. I think also it allows staff in different departments in student affairs as well as external to review functional areas in another area and to have a better sense of relationships, collaboration that might be there from department to department. I think it also helps us in the whole planning model that we have. We do have one in place, but I now see that changing as we attempt to use CAS standards annually in that review process. The evaluation tool, it's certainly a good evaluation tool for us and will force us to look at our programs, to look at the budget that we have in particular areas, to look at space, which is a concern for us. We continue to add programs, continue to do more with little, with no additional dollars, no additional space. We're very good about that in student affairs. Maybe we can begin to say no to some of that and find some additional dollars to help us in those program areas.
Dr. William Bryan, we now go live in studio once again to discuss the professional issues. And do you all have a reaction, or perhaps there's some other professional issues that you'd like to discuss as well? Betty?
I think an overarching concern for professional preparation and professional development programs would probably encompass most of what we have just heard. The replication and advancement of our field is really dependent on those that we induct annually in graduate programs. And I think we have a wealth of resources. I think we attempt to address most of these issues. The CAS standards have certainly been very helpful, but are not necessarily an end in and of themselves. I think we're going to have to, as associations and as a profession, take a look at the ways in which we induct or prepare our new professionals across the country. We have almost an upside-down curriculum. And at the master's level, we give them a general education, and then they take a specific position. At the doctoral level, they specialize, and then they become the generalist, so that we have specialist, generalist, specialists throughout. We depend heavily on professional development, and I think the content and direction of those professional development programs is a major issue. So I would wrap the whole thing up with a preparation concern.
Betty, I think a great deal of emphasis needs to be placed on the fact that we do have professional preparation programs and how important they are. I think what troubles some people, if you look at the standards or if you look at the criteria that were mentioned by Paul Bloland, is the fact that a person may become a student affairs person without professional preparation. And we need to do more in influencing who is hired in the field so that we're sure that they have the kind of professional preparation that you've just described.
Could you give some examples of how someone becomes one when they're not a professional student affairs person?
Well, you'll see ads in the Chronicle, for example, for a person to fill a student personnel position, and it will list educational preparation, and it could say in student personnel, it could say social work, it could say law, depending upon the specialty that the individual is going to handle. And I cringe every time I see one of those, because I'd like the jobs to be limited to people with preparation in student personnel work. I think that there's a lot that people can bring to the field from experience in other fields, but it still troubles me a great deal that our controls are not as tight as they might be for entry.
I'm very proud of the programs that we have, and I would echo Ann's comments to a certain extent, but I do think that there are some folks who can make important contributions to this field who do not come out of our preparation programs as such. We have some very strong preparation programs. I would like to see some of those programs become more diverse in the training that they provide to students, to include law and management courses, because some of the kinds of things that we're being asked to do demand those kinds of skills.
But I think we ought to put some of that into our preparation programs. Okay. We prepare what's called middle managers. And these people come out of master's degree programs and they go right into a management kind of responsibility. And some programs are lacking or weak or soft on developing the management skills, and I would agree very much with you that they ought to realize the kind of responsibilities that their graduates are going to have and put this into the program.
Do you think that ACPA and NASPA ought to take more of a leadership role in trying to change some of the preparation programs?
I think that ought to be added. I certainly do. I think those are the two organizations that ought to take responsibility.
I think they should take the leadership.
Several years ago at another institution, one morning I received a phone call from the chair of the philosophy department. He indicated that he had a member of his faculty who was not going to make tenure, knew that we were advertising for a position, and suggested that his assistant professor would be a good candidate. I reached over and picked up a job description and said to the department head, does this person have a good foundation in investigative skills? That is, research design, evaluation, statistics. His response was, I'm not sure. I said, does he have a good background in theory? Does he know something about the development of the age of college students? And does he know some things about social and anthropological as well as psychology matters? Furthermore, does he know some things about intervention? How do we go about bringing about changes and offering supports to our students? And does he know about our ethics, the standards that we have? Has he been served an internship of any kind? I remember at the conclusion of that, his comment was, Jim, I didn't realize there was that much to what you do. I think he went away with deeper respect. And I think the thoughts that there is a foundation that hopefully is common to us all says something about both initial preparation and aren't those people who come into our profession who truly have some things to offer but need some training, some gearing up. An attorney comes in with some, I think, or an MBA may come in with some good preparations, but I would fear that they're not ready to fully serve you until they move in the direction of providing maybe on-the-job training, but until they acquire a foundation of knowledge and skills in some of these basic areas.
Well, Jim, like any other profession, we provide a foundation, but it's a continual education process. I think that's why we've made advancement in the last 20 years, because we've been able to stimulate the self-discovery process with our graduates.
That's something I'd like to amplify on if I could. I have very strong feelings about this. I have a brother who's a physician, and I noticed that he is required by his own profession to engage in professional development activity each year in order to continue practicing that profession. I got my doctorate in 1965, many years ago now. Never have I been required by my profession to update my skills in any way, and I feel bad about that. There are lots of opportunities for us. Perhaps there ought to be some requirements.
I'd like to return to a point that Gary Knock made about the humanitarians coming into the field. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who feel that that's what's needed. If you ask some students, master students, why they chose student personnel work, and they'll say, I just love people. And sure, we need people who love people. We really do. But we need all those other characteristics that have been listed here. You'll find that in some of the earlier days, and probably still now, people from athletics are calling and said, we have a tired or worn out coach. You know, he's just great with the kids. You know, wouldn't you like to have him on your staff? So professional preparation is just extremely important. I don't think we can emphasize it too much. And continuing education in that
Is there
area.
another issue? If not, I have a lot of questions for you. Do you have another issue?
We'd be happy to hear questions.
All right. This is from the University of Wisconsin Center System. The question is there a trend to decentralize services such as minority and women's services? If so, what is the impact?
Decentralized, not sure.
I think I understand that. I have a concern that with the decentralization of services, we lose some power, some influence, some substance. There is something to be gained with a critical mass of professional colleagues talking to each other, planning together, scheming, strategizing with regard to how to get a job done. And whereas that needn't always be in one location, I would have a concern that if there is a decentralization, that each of those decentralized places have a critical mass of people and not be isolated professionals out trying to do their work.
Coordination is needed as well.
Exactly.
If they are included within the umbrella of student concern services, that's helpful, but many times they become a special branch.
Have you noticed a trend going in that direction?
I
A
have
practice,
not.
but not a trend.
I have not.
Okay. We have a live phone call we're going to take right now. So if the caller will respond, tell us who you are and from where you're calling, please. Hello, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
My name is Braden Kuhlman, and I'm the site coordinator at University of South Carolina.
Welcome. What is your
Hello.
question? What is
My question is, because of sometimes intangible results from certain student affairs areas, student development functions are sometimes seen as unnecessary and often worthless, or at best, certainly not need to be handled by a professionally trained person. What is your opinion as to how a college might take steps to alleviate this attitude, especially among academicians?
How do you make yourself of value to your campus?
That's the assessment question that we were hoping we would get. I think as a profession, we have been confused for years about the differences between evaluation of specified goals and programming and assessment, or the impact or long-range impact of the results of the activities. And if I understood the question correctly, the caller said many times it's the intangible results. Well, if they're intangible, then they still are assessable. And I think our whole field is looking toward assessment by the humanists, not necessarily assessment by the data researchers.
You know, the emphasis upon higher education in the 1980s is that wonderful word quality or excellence. And I think the student affairs profession should be every bit as much a part of that as the academic side of higher education. And one of the jobs of the chief student affairs officer on every campus is to persuade others that the programs being proposed in student affairs have real value. And I know I find myself doing that frequently, but we need good information about the benefits of the things that we do. There are ways that we can show that our programs do have real benefit for the campus.
For example, as an administrator, let's take an issue. Attracting students, if we want to increase our enrollment, and the retention of students. I would like to believe that there are those among us, our colleagues out there, who know a lot about matches and mismatches with regard to institutions. That is, which students should go to which institutions according to individual characteristic and institutional uniqueness match. I would also like to think that we know just about as much as anyone, collectively, about the process of what makes students stay at a university, ranging from the humanistic caring to the skill preparation so that they can succeed academically. And so as an administrator, I don't even look to the more esoteric kind of assessment that I think we're going to get in the business of doing more of, but simply our contributions to such things as attracting additional students and helping more of those students succeed in the university. And Art, yes, I do think we need to attend more systematically to doing that, so that as an administrator also, when we talk to our others who think and speak like administrators, we have something to say about what our contributions are.
I think the caller is begging the question, how do we measure? How do we catch on to the parade? How do we tag on? How can we prove that our contributions helped in retention?
Okay, Betty, if we put in place a program of intervention, then we can simply, in the most simplistic way, count how many students applied, how many were appropriate and were accepted, and how many are there after the first semester and the second semester.
But so many of our programs don't lend themselves to such neat measurement as maybe retention. For example, we've been charged, or I've charged our staff as well at the University of Florida, to efforts to personalize the institution. We have 35,000 students. That's a big task. Now, how do you measure something like that? One of the ways, I think, is for us not to isolate ourselves as student affairs professionals in our own little corner of the campus with our own little programs and issues. I think to involve faculty members, administrators, board members, alumni, and of course, all the students we can will help the support of our programs.
I need to change subjects if we can. This question comes in from the Dallas County Community College. The statement is, student personnel theory and research of the past 50 years is basically, ethnically sterile. How do you see the profession addressing this issue and the demography of our country changing?
Yeah. Again, I would say that's an astute question. And though I wouldn't be quite as harsh in saying that it is sterile, I would say one of the challenges that faces us in general as a profession has to do with exactly what the caller is identifying, and that is the demographic composition of our population will be radically different 20 years from now. It's changing now. Basically, we simply need to attend more systematically to making sure that the research, the information we do, is directed to all of the special groups, ethnically, with regard to handicaps, with regard to gender. We simply need to be, I think, do a better job than we have in the past of making that a more comprehensive circumstance.
We need to focus on the concept of community for each of these groups so that they are truly assimilated within the campus, whatever the specific nature of the campus might be. And that takes mentors, it takes many, many things.
I think we need also to think about the kinds of people that we are attracting to the field. I don't know whether that's the caller's bent or not, but we have very few minorities who are attracted to graduate preparation programs. And this may be partly our fault. It may be our fault as far as our recruitment procedures are concerned. Making the field attractive to minorities. Of course, this leads to some other things about people who teach in the field as well. I think we can find the same problem there. Very, very few minorities are professors in student preparation programs. So there's a lot that we need to do. We need to think about as well the course content that is provided in our preparation program, whether or not we give enough attention or sufficient attention to cultural differences and prepare those people who are going out from our programs to be sensitive to these cultural differences, to be aware of problems, to know how to deal with conflict resolution that may develop among various ethnic groups particularly. So I think we have a long way to go in that area.
May we shift gears?
I'd like to say one more thing, if possible. In 1971, NASPA sponsored the Wing Spread Conference for minority students. 40 minority students were invited to a conference in Wisconsin for an entire weekend. The purpose of it was to find outstanding college seniors from throughout the country who might be interested in going into student affairs. I think we need to try more programs like that to encourage black and Hispanic and other minority young people into the profession. Most other disciplines have active programs in this regard, and I think our associations need to get on with it. That's the end of my commercial.
Thank you. St. Louis Community College, Forest Park. Dean Channon called in. Should student affairs positions receive faculty status? If yes, what is needed to ensure student advocacy on our part and a separation of agenda when dealing with contract representative groups such as NEA, AFT, And should we be concerned?
A lot there.
Faculty status for student affairs individuals?
That gets to be a very complicated kind of issue dependent on the contractual arrangement. I noticed that there was some concern for AAUP, AFFT. Many union contracts define the faculty in terms of course load, student credit hour generation, and have another evaluative system in place, which would make it very difficult for student personnel workers to have or to wish to be faculty members. Many of us are faculty members and teach on a part-time or shared basis in institutions where unionism is not a major concern. This has been debated for what, 40 years, 50 years in terms of student personnel, faculty relationships, but I think it's been exacerbated in recent years because of the economic factors and because of the role of faculty in governance that we've not touched on at all today. I think there's been a shift. I think faculty have a different role in relationship. I think if we can become comfortable with our signal and our significant role within the campus community as professionals, working in a supportive and, if we can use the old word, co-curricular way, that the debate will die. We will be faculty in the sense that we are performing out-of-class educational kinds of services with students and for students.
I think it's interesting. Go ahead, Art. I think it's interesting that all four of us have academic rank, as we were introduced. But I think the caller is talking about academic rank as professionals in student affairs. For the moment, I just simply come down on the side of, for the present, not being supportive of having separate academic appointments for student affairs, but at the same time valuing very highly my academic affiliation with my discipline.
Let's take a phone call. Hello, could you tell us who you are and from where you're calling? Hello, are you there?
Hello, yes.
Go right ahead.
This is Dallin Sanders from Eastern New Mexico University in Portales.
Welcome.
What are some of the things occurring in universities that bring academic affairs and student affairs closer together?
Okay, thank you for your call. Academic affairs and student affairs, what's bringing them closer together?
Well, I'll respond briefly. Almost everything that we do, it seems, should bring academic affairs and student affairs together. We should be concerned as student affairs folks as to what happens in the classroom, what academic requirements are, what is going on with retention, recruiting of students, financial aid. Those are just some quick off the top of my head kinds of notions that we share with academic affairs. I meet with those folks all the time, and so do our staff, and so I don't see the clear separation that perhaps is implied.
I think the new concern across the country for undergraduate reform is going to give us the opportunity to be center stage, to be involved to the extent that we want to be involved.
I think I made that point earlier, that I thought that we needed to come closer together. If we simply look at the administrative structure, it's very important for the Chief Student Affairs Officer to be at the vice presidential level. It gives this individual entree to discussions at the highest policy-making levels and brings an understanding of student affairs, issues, and problems to that table. I'd agree with Betty. Many of you have read, and of course you will hear later, a speech that Ernest Boyer made at the Chicago Convention. It comes from his book, which is titled College. And when I read that book, realizing that it was written by an academician, I felt like I was reading a classic student personnel workbook, student affairs book. So I think that I would strongly agree with Betty that interest in the quality of undergraduate education and a belief that it is not strictly limited to intellectual or cognitive development is going to perforce bring the two together.
I must stop us now, I'm sorry, but hold that thought because we're going to take an intermission. It's actually a 50-minute intermission. And what you do at this time is totally up to you. I know in some of the sites you will be having a meeting. Now would be a good time to compose your questions and call them in. As you can see, I've got a few questions already, but we would like to address as many questions as possible. We will be back in 50 minutes, and the best is yet to come. So won't you join us after we take this short intermission?
Are we okay, Ron?